Hey everyone, about to have a chat with Kris Jensen. Kris has been in a couple of groups that I am affiliated with, and I've got to know Kris really well. We are going to talk a lot about his background. Looking forward to talking about his experience with private equity, global groups, change management, product selection, talent and labor, and all the good stuff that we've talked about so far in the last Tech Exec series. Looking forward to this one. I think you guys will enjoy it. Let me know what you think in the comment section below.
Well, this is the second installment of the Tech Exec series that I started. We've got Kris Jensen here. Kris and I know each other pretty well from networking together and being part of an executive group. Kris has a lot of experience, background, which I'm excited to delve into today. Kris, welcome.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate it, and it's an honor to be here with you.
Thank you, thank you. And you're going to be one of the founding guests on this show. We'll look back in months probably to come or years to come and kind of talk more about it and that kind of thing. So, Kris, the reason I asked you, and we did talk about this briefly before we decided to record something, was your private equity background, and then just also your willingness to do a medium to long term and sometimes short term stints with like life with the life expectancy. But before we go into detail about that, do you want to give just a quick background of like your career, just to go through your many engagements or your wonderful engagements?
Yeah, sure, Greg. Just a brief background for those watching is I've been involved with two private equity plays where we had a successful exit. I was the chief information officer for both of those companies. First started as a consultant and then transitioned to a full-time employee after the deal was closed. Previous to that, I've had some international stints where I helped an international commercial real estate developer grow and expand through Europe. And then I've had some IT leadership roles, several of them along the way. But my career really started in consulting. So I was with Anderson Consulting, which is now Accenture. That's where I started my career. And then went to work for a smaller boutique consulting firm in Northern California, where it was made up of individuals who had left the large consulting firms, and we had this smaller consulting firm where we really dealt with the mid-sized clients who were trying to expand and grow. So all of my career has been spent in the mid-sized space with companies that are on fast trajectory growth.
Okay, awesome. And you've also had some international stints too. Let's jump into that piece first. So your international stints, when you were working internationally, were you actually in country or was it just traveling back and forth?
It was traveling back and forth. So it we uh, because of how the international boundaries of data, and at the time they didn't have the same requirements that they knew now, but there was a desire to have strictly an international based company that they were based out of the Netherlands, and then you had your U.S. company. That now the two of them were run by the same individuals, and so there was the same leadership team, but they really just wanted to bifurcate the data side of it. So I was responsible for leading a team of individuals in the Netherlands, as well as a large number of vendors in that market. So what we did is we grew to 32 offices throughout Western Europe and part of Eastern Europe into Poland and Czechoslovakia, and built a data. When I say we built a data center, we used a co-location facility, but we essentially put a data presence in Europe.
That's awesome. So I'm going to jump in with organizational and leadership questions here. You had a team in the Netherlands. Did you have teams in Czechoslovakia and other parts of Europe, or was it just the Netherlands where you had a team?
Just the Netherlands was where the team was, and then these individuals would then go support these various offices throughout Europe and travel throughout Europe. But for labor laws and various other things, we tried to keep everything to one country.
Okay. How did you find managing people in Europe? there's like an American concept that Europeans don't work as harder or longer as the American counterparts. What do you say to that? And how was it in terms of organization and just like leadership? Was there different characteristics you used when you were talking to your colleagues and your employees in Europe?
Oh, no, absolutely. First, anybody in America who thinks that the Europeans don't work as hard. Now in the month of August, they have their holiday and they take it off, and you just have to deal with that. But no, these individuals worked as hard as anybody here in the U.S., if not harder. I mean, they were more dedicated to longer hours and travel, and so and maybe I was blessed, to have some great colleagues in Europe and some great vendors in Europe. But the biggest challenge that I had initially was you take a U.S. mindset that you think that we're all human beings, that culturally we're all the same. And so I went into this mindset like a bull in a china shop, and it didn't come off well. It didn't play well. And so it took some emotional intelligence to understand, okay, a different approach for how, because we were moving fast. We were moving very fast. And you come from an international background, and you know that it's a different mindset. Things move differently. They move at a different pace. And so I had to shift my mindset to handle that pace, still get the work done, when we needed to get it done, but use a completely different tactic to get it done.
Yeah, firstly, as a European, it actually gives me some pride to hear you say that it's not, the stereotype from an American standpoint doesn't actually hold true. Uh, yeah, I suppose, a colleague that I used to work with, and he was an attorney who worked for a company here in Colorado that was spread across the globe. It was a telco company, and he said the major difference, and he worked in the legal department. The major difference actually was how agreements were set up, even down to like a basic like social contract. It was much
Yeah.
easier to go directly to a European person and say, hey, can you do this for me? I need help here. And someone would go do it, even if it was outside their remit or outside their like job description or job requirement. Whereas here, which is funny because you think in your head that in Europe there's more like labor unions and very strict labor laws, but I feel like their social contracts are somewhat stronger. And I don't know that to be true. Again, like it's just something that I've heard that kind of resonated with me. That when you ask somebody to do something, sit down, it's like, hey, can you do this for me? Someone will actually go, okay, let me think about it, but I probably will. Here it's a little bit more like that's not my job. So
Right.
I just remember that being interesting. Also, contracts with vendors was another thing that they brought up. The contracts with vendors were much smaller in Europe, apparently. Did you find that ever?
Yes. Yeah. The contracts were simpler in design and simpler in scope, and so um, they took longer to execute, but in reality they were easier to manage.
Yeah, yeah. I think less sophisticated is what I've heard. They're just
Yes.
more, yeah, just more like outcomes driven than the process all the way through. And you said you found them harder to execute. Was that just, or not harder, but longer to execute? Was that because of, checks and balances, or just again, moving fast was somewhat different, or
I
not
think,
as?
yeah, I think a part of that was caused by the U.S. legal team trying to vet these contracts in the same way that they would the European contracts. We also found that our attorneys in Europe just moved at a slower pace, and so that's a lot of times why it took longer to execute. Is just there wasn't that same urgency that we would have in the U.S.
Yeah. Siesta's getting in the way. Although I don't think they have siestas in the Netherlands. Did you ever like look at the team that you were working with and think like, wow, our value system is very different between what goes on in the Netherlands and the US? Like when you hear like, interactions or whatever.
No, the value systems were very much aligned. One of my biggest struggles was, I had, my US team was trying to interact with the European team. And so while I had made that mental shift, that I could move both directions, the biggest or the hardest challenge I had was getting the two teams to interact. It was because so and so doesn't think like I do. They must not be working as hard. They may not be doing the same things. And so I spent a lot of time really coaching the two sides to work together, to collaborate together to get the job done. And I will say it wasn't until I took members of my U.S. team to Europe that bridge started to be gapped over video conference. You just never had that same empathy. But once you put somebody into the same spot that the individuals were, we'd go out for drinks, or we would just socialize. Then that empathy started to get developed.
That's interesting. So with the pandemic and managing people and having to deal with video conferencing as a way of life, and so far it's kind of holding strong. I know some people are being compelled to go back into the office. Do you think you're losing something with video conference, whether it's Europe or the US? It doesn't really matter. I'm kind of more, just in general.
Yeah, don't take this wrong, or I don't want anybody to take this wrong, that I don't think video conference has a play. These trips to see people doesn't need to happen as frequently, but it goes back to that empathy side. It's difficult when somebody's across the screen to develop that same empathy for individuals. It's those interactions that occur when you get one-on-one. So I think those interactions are still needed, but I don't think they need to happen every day.
Okay, very good. So let's talk about like working actually with private equity companies. How remind me again, how many times have you done it? And let's talk about your first engagement with them.
Yeah, so working with private equity companies for me, was a rewarding experience because, we talk about pace. So you talk about pace and expectation. Private equity companies move at least the ones that I worked with moved at a meteoric pace. I mean, everything had to happen now. There was an urgency to everything that they did. But what I liked about the private equity partner that I worked with is, while they from financial results, there was expediency. They really were hands off from the management company, and so they provided a lot of support to the management company. They provided a lot of advice to the management company, but they put strong leaders in place and said, "Hey, go run this and do what you need to do. We're here as a support. We're here as a resource, but go run the company."
And for somebody that's interested to go work from an IT side with private equity companies that are, buying any type of organization, what would you say before someone were to like step into a role like that? What would they need to be armed with, if it was information or some sort of like skill set? There is obviously a con, there's always a pro with anything. What would the con be first, and then what's the well, you kind of talked about the pro. So what's the con, or
Yeah. The con is this private equity partner is not going to be involved for a long period of time. There's an exit. There's a duration. It's 3 to 5 years. Sometimes it's longer, but there's a duration in what they do. And so there's a high probability that when you go to work for a private equity backed company, that company will either go through a recapitalization where the private equity partner exits, and in both of my cases, the assets were sold. And so the management company was shut down, so that the entire management team, the entire staff was let go.
Okay.
And so that's the downside.
Yeah, and you knew that was coming yet again, right? There was no like halfway through it, like shock horror, this is going to come to an end pretty abruptly.
No, that's correct. You hope for an outcome where the management company survives. In most of the case, they do. In most circumstances, the management company survives. A new equity partner comes in, and so the company shifts when that occurs. But when you go to work with private equity backed companies, you have to have the mindset that there's going to be an exit that occurs. And that exit will disrupt, the company, and will disrupt your life, sometimes to the negative, sometimes to the positive.
Okay. And with private equity companies, you were brought in to audit certain technologies, companies, that kind of thing. Can you give me more kind of context on that? Like what kind of audits were they, and how did you feed that information from a communication standpoint back to the private equity company, back to the management company? And I know it's buy side, sell side, but how would you go about giving that information back?
Yeah, so I worked on the buy side of the equation. Obviously, once you're with the company, you're involved with the sell side, but from a different perspective. And so, in my case, I was working as a consultant, and I was brought in to do a technology assessment. So, one has to keep in mind when a private equity company comes in and buys a platform. In my case, they were both real estate plays. And so when they come in and buy a platform, they see opportunity in that platform to grow and scale it. And so, but typically the previous owner hasn't, didn't see that same vision and that same direction. It's why private equity has a play in it. Or private equity will take multiple assets, bring them together to grow those. And so, they'll combine. And so in one of my cases, the platform already existed, and in the other, the platform was built. And so, but in both of them, systems became a target right out of the gate, because if you're going to scale and grow, what you have to have is you have to have the parts and pieces to do it. And so what I would do is come in and do a technology assessment. It was really a technology and strategy and process assessment. So it involved more than just technology. And then what I would do is write essentially an abbreviated report to give to the management team, which then was offered to the board of directors of these companies to say, here's the challenges we're going to have if we want to scale these platforms. Here's the gaps. Here's system needs that we have. And then we would develop together an IT strategy or a technology strategy to solve the technology needs, to solve the process, to help address the process needs, to help this company scale and grow.
Okay. And when you would do that, were you ever asked to implement what you found or what you discovered, like the go forward plan?
Now, in both cases, yes. So a funny conversation is one of these management companies that was PE backed. Is we went through this whole assessment. We'd have at the end we'd have a strategy session of these technology assessments, and at the end of these, we'd lay out what needed to happen, what the roadmap was to go forward. And I wasn't planning on going to work for the company. I was already in a pretty good gig. And I asked at the end of it, I said, so what's next steps? And the CEO said, we'd like to have you go to work for us and execute on this.
Nice. Okay. And when you wrote your own plan, essentially wrote your own like job description, did you already discover the length of time you'd be doing it for, or was it an undefined amount of time when you're in that situation?
Yeah, it was undefined. So I didn't know, my first time I didn't understand how private equity worked from, when they acquire companies. And so I saw a great platform, I saw great growth, and I saw the competitors that we were working against, or to beat, and I thought this was going to last forever. And so I had no idea that these would be short-term stints. My first time. The second time I went in with eyes wide open, so I was much more aware of what we were doing. Although when you do these, Greg, you don't build them to just last a few years. You're building a platform that will last into perpetuity, because the idea of an exit is whoever buys that can take that platform and grow it as well. So that everything we did was with a long-term view in mind, not a short-term view in mind.
Okay. So outside of private equity companies, you said you worked with real estate. Where else have you worked at?
Well, in each of the cases that I've done have been, either rapid growth, where they were really on this cusp of really expanding. But I've also been involved with turnaround situations where it was I stepped into a complete train wreck and had to turn it around.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about that, because turnarounds are interesting. I know they're fun. Again, it can kind of lead to sleepless nights. I've actually worked with a turnaround pretty recently. If you believe in the product or the company, it makes it easier. What were the turnarounds? What were the companies? What were the products?
Yeah, so it was a construction company, and I had a relationship. A former colleague, CFO at another company. He and I actually were involved with this Rapid Growth International developer, and he had stepped in as CFO of this construction company, and it was right during 2013. So as companies were coming out of the Great Recession, there was still just a lot of turmoil in the industry where people were still trying to downsize, still trying to shift down and start back up. And this construction company had a major client. They were over 50% of their revenue. Pack their bags and leave the company. Essentially, they were doing tenant improvements for them, and they said, hey, we're not doing this anymore. Thank you very much. And so they lost 50% of their business overnight.
Wow.
And yeah, and so you've got a steep drop in revenue, and they'd had a long-term IT director who was really looking out for. He had built his own fiefdom, and in this own fiefdom, he had created this black hole where management had no idea what he was doing. He was spending an inordinate amount of money, and so people started to get into his business a little bit, because as you have this drop in revenue, you're looking for all sources of where you can scale and drop, and shift. And when they started to get into what he was doing, they realized that he wasn't doing much of anything except spending inordinate amounts of money.
When you say a huge amount of money, what was it? Just on technology products and just contractors and vendors, or was it, just wasting money? I don't know. I don't know. When you say
Yeah.
just, sorry, go ahead.
Well, for example, we had a $50,000 SAN. The first day I walked in the door, there was this $50,000 SAN sitting in a corner, not implemented, just collecting dust. It'd been there for 9 months.
Okay.
And so, so equipment not, purchased but not implemented, contracts that were way out of line. So, these telecom contracts that made no sense why were they inked in the first place. They weren't beneficial to this company. They were beneficial to the vendor, and they had evergreen clauses to them. So they were just going to keep clicking over and over. And systems that were in complete deterioration. They had physical servers. Now they had purchased new servers to virtualize everything, but nothing had ever gotten virtualized. So they were all these physical servers. And so they let the IT director go. When he went, multiple staff, IT staff members left. And so when I stepped on board day one, there was just one help desk person who had really no deep technical background. They were really green at the help desk. And so I was charged to come in and figure out what happened. How do we turn this around quickly? And so for the first 6 months, it was just trying to wrap your arms around, okay, why is this SAN sitting in the corner? But then servers started to fail. So now we had servers that were failing. And so I had a MSP partner who was, I had worked with previously, had actually worked for them. And I brought them in, with some deep technical experience. But it took us about 6 months to turn that whole situation around from a hardware standpoint. And then you had the whole application side that then had to be addressed. So it was just one thing after another.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there when you walk in and you've got one help desk person. So when you walked in, what was your first action? You said it was like to figure out hardware. Were you also trying to hire people and onboard vendors at the same time, or was it just trying to figure out where things meet and things end, so to
It
speak?
was, first of all, it was bringing in a partner who had at least, strong network engineers. I'd had some infrastructure background, so I understood servers, I understood virtualization. So from a conceptual level, but there was only so much of me to go around.
Yeah.
And so I felt my best talent wasn't getting in the weeds. My best talent was being a director of the orchestra. So I brought people into the organization where I was the general. So I knew where the problems were. I knew where the critical needs were. And then I put very narrow scoped people who knew how to solve that problem onto that problem to get it fixed and get it running for us.
So it was a people-led solution in reality.
Yes. Yeah, it was a
Okay.
people-led solution. The SAN sitting in the corner, for example, the SAN sitting in the corner sat there for another week before it was implemented, because that was the final piece to getting the whole server virtualization up and running. And so we implemented that quickly, and then we started to migrate these servers that were failing over to our virtual environment. What it did is it put a band-aid on the problem until we could build servers from scratch and take these same workloads that were on these failing servers, into a new environment. So, and also old OSs. So we had OSs that we were dealing with that Microsoft was no longer supporting.
Okay. And that happens regularly. Did you use when you were replacing servers? Did you replace servers or move it to like a public cloud, or was it more on-prem that you needed to keep it? What was the strategy at the time?
Yeah, at the time, the cloud really had not. I mean, AWS was there, but people just didn't move workloads to the cloud. That was this was back in 2013. And so 2013, 2014. And so, this concept of moving things to the cloud really had not started to take hold. They were expensive. And so everything we were doing was in a private cloud there in the facility. So,
Okay, so it was
I
all.
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I got a funny story with this. So it reminded me when I was saying it was all in their facility. It was a private cloud. Um, so they had a situation where the data center was at this facility in California, and so it was sitting out away from a major city. So it was a suburb, and power was a constant problem at this location where the power would go out regularly during the summer from California blackouts, brownouts, and so or wildfires. So you name it. So power was also our issue where the power was constantly going out during and all this happened during a summertime. And so I'm stepping in, power's going out. Servers wouldn't come back up, once the power went out because we found out the UPSs didn't have the capacity to run these servers for any length of time.
So on top of everything else, the power and the location was losing energy, so you couldn't call on any data or any records or anything like
Correct.
that on a regular basis. Okay.
Yep.
And were you operating at a 24/7 operation? Was that like the promise you made to the business, or
Well,
what was
I
the?
mean, it was available. The concept was it was available 24/7, but the reality is most of the workforce, cut loose after 6 p.m. And so it was a small number who had the expectation that they would, anytime, anywhere they could get to their data. But there were a lot of frustrated people because what they didn't realize is you have this viewpoint that this new guy steps in, everything's falling apart at the same time, and it must be this new guy who's screwing everything up. So
Did you have to? Yeah, that's a tough situation. So how did you deal with that? How did you deal with people thinking that you were to blame, which is honestly very common with IT, right? When something doesn't work, it seems to always be IT technology's fault. So how did you deal with that, especially from being just like day one, day two, and that was your fault?
it would have been very easy to blame the previous guy and say, "Hey, it was his fault."
Yeah.
But I didn't play the blame game. There was no time to play the blame game, and that's just not how I work. And so, what I spent, it was really outlining what the path forward is, explaining, what the challenges were, what we were dealing with at that point in time, and there are lots of darts coming from lots of different directions, but it was maintaining a cool head, and when people understood where your vision was and where you were going, it answered the obvious question that this guy clearly isn't the one who screwed it up. So, this guy's got a vision, got a direction, and he's executing on it. And so I started to get a lot of grace out of it. People started to understand that it was circumstances inherited, and that I had a path forward, and that I inherited this mess, but I was going to make the best of it.
Yeah, I think honestly that's the best attitude to have in leadership in a time of like crisis, which, like, let's be honest, that sounds like it was a time of crisis. If you come with more problems, when people come to you with problems, everyone leaves a meeting or an interaction kind of like annoyed. Whereas if you
Yep.
actually give people a solution, at least you're giving them hope and expectation of a positive outcome. So that's good. When before you started in engagement, and I wrote this down when we talked because you seem to be like a vision, message, narrative type person. What when you go into an engagement, do you think about the vision before you start, or do you do some kind of poking around and getting to know the business before you kind of figure out a vision, or do you have like a set vision when you go into a place? Not, I don't mean like a go forward analytical plan. I mean a vision for what you would consider a positive outcome, what your own definition of done looks like.
Yeah, my definition done isn't one that I create, and so whatever circumstance, whether it be a consulting engagement or whether it be a full-time role, In my case, most of my consulting arrangements have rolled into a full-time role. So maybe I view the world differently than people who just step in, Greg. But to answer the question, I never take my vision. What I really want to do is I'm focused on the business. What are the business outcomes? Where can we derive value from a technology perspective? And so everything I look at is where can we drive value and revenue to the business? What impact can we have on the business moving forward? And so the only way you can do that is interacting with the business leaders. It starts at the top with the CEO, COO, CFO, and then you have to move to department leadership and really get a vision for them. So that's one of the great things that I feel really blessed that I've been able to do is I meet with all these leaders of the organization, these great leaders of the organization. I take this, each of them has kind of a siloed view of what success looks like to them. And then, my goal is to synthesize these siloed views into one larger technology strategy and roadmap. But everything gets checked with the senior management first. The CEO has to buy off on this plan and say, Kris, what you've designed here is really going to add value to our organization. And a lot of times it's more of a collaborative effort. So I'm with the senior management team sitting at a table and saying, hey, here's what I've seen, here's what I envision. Where would you guys add to that? So we synthesize this information, and that's the go forward plan.
Interesting. Yeah, so you're like, so organizational change, organizational shift is, I suppose, decided from an executive level standpoint, and then also an executive level standpoint, but then also organizationally. When you're trying to actually implement change, how do you continue to do it? Because it's kind of like a continuous integration. What's your plan? How do you do change management and change from an entire organizational standpoint continuously? Because I know that's the biggest problem working with large organizations, because I've worked with Fortune 250 companies that are going through change management, and when there's a problem, it's usually people at a either individual contribution level or at a team lead level that doesn't agree with the change. And I'm always interested to see how you get past some of those roadblocks, and it's usually quite an important team that actually stopped the change. So what is your strategy there?
No, Greg, you've brought up a key challenge that that everybody faces in a change management circumstance. It doesn't matter where you're at, but one of the things that I've discovered over the years, when it comes to change management, is any directive that is created at the top and pushed down generally has a success rate of 0. When it gets to the bottom, because management, they have a view and a strategy of the company and where it's going, but they're not always aware of the challenges on the ground. The boots on the ground can tell you what's working and what's not working. And so what I've found is kind of this bottom up approach to change management. And so you really work from the bottom up, understand, okay, if we do these things, what's the impact on individuals? And so as you understand the impact of the individuals, and you've heard me use the word empathy a lot, and because you've got to have empathy for those who do the day-to-day work, and this change is the one that's going to be the biggest impact on them. It's going to change how they do, and it doesn't matter if it makes their life easier. In their mind, they're thinking, most people think a negative thought of change. Well, if this makes my job easier, does that make it easier for my job to be eliminated?
Yeah, that and that often becomes the problem.
Yes.
People can kind of see 6 months to 2 years down the road when there's an organizational shift. And I think often the question is, will I be here when this is all said and done? Because often it's like either automation or creation of a different way to work that may not require a business analyst or a product manager anymore to do their, or anything, like a help desk.
Yep.
It's interesting.
Yeah. So anytime you try to simplify things or try to streamline, that seems to be the big, and people, when I say all of us, some of us love change and we thrive in change, but it's the uncertainty, and the uncertainty is what creates anxiety. And when you've got anxiety, what you've got is an unwillingness to move. And so what you have to do is work through all of those, and one individual can't do it. And so what I found is it starts with the lowest rung, the bottom up approach, that pyramid with the CEO at the top and people at the bottom. You flip that around and you really work on the largest, the people who touch your customers the most, which, wherever that, that's that, uh, line of business type of folks who touch your customers, who are most involved in the process. And the more you involve them, the more you coach them on where the benefit of this is, the value, the value proposition to what we're doing, the more success that I've had in the change management space. If you try to shortchange that, uh, most of the time, any effort that you try to do will see limited results. You'll get it done, but adoption becomes then the long range problem.
That's interesting. And throughout this conversation we've had so far, you've talked about empathy. And I think if you have empathetic people that are dealing with your end clients or end users, usually the outcome from who you're trying to work with or who you're trying to work with on a sales standpoint. What I was going to say was that that's a great way to conduct change management. Often, and I've worked with certain agile teams, like for instance, Safe Agile. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. I'm actually certified in it. I've gone through it. I've never actually implemented it, but the idea is that a lot of the communication and understanding from a leadership and a bottom down is like it's actually like that middle tier of management, and it's pushing up and down essentially to make sure that communication is key, which is a great idea. But if you're in theory, I think that it is flawed. Like a lot, like everything has its pros and cons. I think that the flaw there is that if you don't take stock of what's happening on a day-to-day basis with the people that are truly working with your clients, there is always a roadblock there. So that is yeah. So that's very good.
Yeah.
And again, it's all empathy, right?
What is, and when it comes to change management, we sometimes try to shortchange the process to move it faster because we know from a strategic standpoint, we know what we're going to do is going to make somebody's life better. At least from our viewpoint, we know it's going to make their life better. But if all they do is resist the change, then it never is going to make their life better, and it's a muted result that you get out of whatever you're implementing, whatever you're doing. And so the idea behind it is now you've just extended it years rather than if you address it up front, you can expedite that in an agile method and really shorten the time frame where that change comes into play. And inevitably, you're never going to get it 100% right. I mean, it would be foolish to think you're going to, but you learn, and just as you mentioned, agile, it's really just learning. It's learning and adapting, and moving that way.
Yeah, it's funny. It's the reiteration, right? I mean, you don't have to like commit to one set of criteria. You the reiteration, the constant continuous feedback loop in agile, in safe,
Yep.
or in any sort of methodology that allows you to like change or at least understand what's happening, where the roadblock is within a timely manner, is probably the biggest success to change management in the last little while.
Absolutely.
From a leadership standpoint, you're definitely an empathetic leader, also results driven. How do you lead teams? Like when you're going in and managing people, what's your core understanding of leadership?
When I say this, first of all, it takes into it has the assumption that those who you're leading are really talented at what they do. They're really good at what they do. And so I look at leadership as a way to remove their roadblocks, move obstacles out of the way so they can ultimately be successful. And so that's number one is you move obstacles out of the way, give them clearly defined objectives of where you want them to go. Everybody wants a leader. I don't care where you're at in the organization. Even a CEO wants their board to provide leadership to them. And so those who you work for want a solid leader. They want somebody who empathetic, who has grace. So when they make mistakes, that they're not punished for those mistakes unless they're doing something to harm the company. Most people aren't thinking of that. So they want to know that they can make mistakes and iterate as they go along, get better as they go along. So in my mind, true leadership comes from empathy, comes from grace, and comes from moving obstacles out of people's way so that they can ultimately be successful. And providing a clear, I forgot the part, provide a clear vision of where you're trying to go. So they, in their minds, they know I'm trying to go here and this is how I accomplish it.
That's very good. Would you say you're and I know you're going to say no, but would you put a lot of emphasis on people working 9 to 5 and metrics, or are you more like results driven? What's your...
You're right. The answer is no. There's not a clock. I'm much more results driven. What is it? As long as people are moving in the right direction, doing, I don't care if they what their hours are. Previous company I was at, we had what was called core hours. So we wanted people to be available in these core hours. And the reason for that is for collaboration purposes. But what you did outside of those core hours, as long as you were available those core hours, that was what was important to us.
Okay. So in your last company, people were remote and it just be available when needed?
Well, that was the idea is when I asked for, hey, do you have a few minutes and you're not in a meeting, on a team chat, during the pandemic, during those core hours, the assumption is that you were not walking your dog and shopping and so forth. Obviously people had appointments they needed to go to, but that they were available during those core hours so we could bring people together in a rapid fashion to make decisions.
Yeah. It's funny, just on a side and talking about like core hours and just being available. I started working with this company quite recently, and at the very top of their requirements for me to help them find somebody was be available 9 to 5. And I was like, that seems like a very obvious criteria, very obvious like ask. And the lady I was working with said, no, it's actually not. I've had 3 people that I've had to let go because what had happened is they would produce documentation and lines of code and reports, but at like 3 o'clock in the morning. And while she was waking up to reports, that's not necessarily ideal. Like, that's information she should have known earlier or after. And it's funny, it's becoming more and more a requirement now that 9 to 5, because remote, you're not seeing that person, it has to be listed as like a requirement to take a job. It's funny, right, how the world has changed.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
and so for our purposes, it still comes down to results. I don't want somebody just punching a clock and then sitting in the office and then punching it on the way out. We used the term punch clock. Nobody does that anymore.
Yeah.
The idea is I want people who are driven to get things done, and if they can get it done in 2 hours, fantastic. If it takes them the whole day, fantastic. But just be available, and that's really during for collaborative purposes.
Awesome. Well, Kris, it was great talking to you here. We're on 50 minutes by my recording, which it feels like it was only 20. If I'm being honest, it feels like
It went
we're kind of,
fast.
yeah, it went fast. It feels like we're just getting into it. I really appreciate your time. This has been excellent, and I'll talk to you soon. I'm going to stop.